So last week we looked at Peter the fisherman. This week the title is Peter the Independent. We're going to see why that was the case. Luke chapter 22 verses 31 and 32 says, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you, that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. Simon Peter was a person like us. He was like every one of us in one way or another. And it was similar to what was said in James 5:17 about Elijah, that he was a man with a nature like us. He faced the problems that we face. He had plenty of shortcomings, yet there's no question that he followed Christ. It was going to take plenty of failures in his life for him to finally come to the right conclusion and begin to change and grow to become the man that God intended him to be. But early in his life, this dominant feature that he considered a virtue, but was certainly something less than that, was his independent spirit. Now we know that he had lots of opportunities to get to know Jesus. He was open to those opportunities as well. And he pursued Jesus, and that's a very positive thing. We know that he sought out and knew God, and in the end, that won the day for him, at least towards the end of his life. Isaiah 55 verses 6 and 7 says, Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he's near. And that's an opportunity for every one of us, isn't it? You don't have to come here this morning to do that, although it helps. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts. Let him return to the Lord, that he may have compassion on him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon. And we're going to look at Peter's life and some of the failures that he faced. We're going to look at those today. But in some ways, he lived a life of failures, at least early on in the story. He messed up, not just once, but time after time after time. And yet, he called on the Lord and he sought God, and because of that, he was abundantly pardoned. And we'll even see some of that pardoning happening this week as well as next week. He called upon the Lord. He was independent, however, and wanted his own way. That didn't help because it bound him to failure when that was the dominant attitude in his life. And it's the same for all of us. When we try to do things ourselves in our own way, we're destined towards failure. Our dependence has to be on the Lord and not on ourselves. Our dependence can't even be on another person because they're just like us. They're prone to failure. So it must be on the Lord, because if it's not, we're going to be disappointed. So we're going to look at instances in Peter's life where he exhibited this independent spirit, like us, but it didn't work out so well in the end. He needed to have that attitude of humility where he could figure out that he couldn't sing that song, I Did It My Way. And it turned out well in the end, because it never turned out well in the end when he did it his way. In Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 through 20, we have one of these first stories, and halfway through the story, it's so positive. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked the disciples, Who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they say, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others Jeremiah, or also one of the prophets. He said unto them, But who do you say that I am? Simon Peter replied, You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. That's quite a statement, isn't it? And Jesus answered him, Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, which means Simon, son of Jonah. For flesh and blood has not revealed it to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Now, this verse has been taken a lot of different ways, at least the end of it, saying Simon and calling him a rock, but we don't know the context of what was happening completely. Did Jesus say, Simon, you're the rock? No, he didn't. He said, Simon, upon this rock. Did Jesus say, Simon, upon this rock? We don't know that. Or was there a physical feature of the land around them? And we know where this was said. There does give some reason to think that Jesus was even pointing to a mountain, saying, upon this rock. And it was actually a location where there had been a lot of persecution for the Jews. The Romans had literally murdered, slaughtered hundreds, if not thousands, of Jews in that location in the previous generation. So we don't know if Jesus was pointing to Simon Peter, to himself, to the rock, or to something else. So we don't know exactly what that was referencing. But we do know that Jesus pointed out that Peter had a revelation from God, even to know that Jesus was the Messiah, that he was the one, that he was the Christ, the living Son of God. He had clearly heard from God, and he responded in this way, and Jesus clearly states that. He's like, Peter, you just had a revelation. What an amazing thing. Peter got it right here, didn't he? Didn't he? That was quite the compliment that Jesus gave him. He knew who Jesus was. He knew the power that Jesus had, yet Peter was still prone to failure, wasn't he? He knew all the facts. He had a revelation, but he was still prone to failure, just as we are. There's a hymn that we sing from time to time, and the title of the hymn is Come Thou Fount. It says, Oh, to grace, how great a debtor daily I'm constrained to be. Let thy goodness like a fetter bind my wandering heart to thee. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. That's an ironic phrase, isn't it? The God I love, and yet we're prone to leave him, aren't we? And Peter recognized that Jesus was the Christ, that he was the all-powerful Son of God who had come to earth, and yet he was prone to wander, wasn't he? Even though he got it right in these sentences, almost immediately after, Jesus gives him this compliment, and then Jesus gives the ultimate statement back to him in Matthew 16, 21 through 23. Now you've got to remember this is 3 verses later, so it's just a little bit time difference in time. Was it immediately? We don't know. It could have been some hours or possibly even days. It says, From that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside. Isn't that impressive? Oh, Jesus, come over here. I need to tell you something. Took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, Far be it from you, Lord. This shall never happen to you. There was that independent attitude coming out. But he turned and said to Peter, Jesus turned to him and said, Get behind me, Satan. Few verses prior to that, he had figured it all out. Jesus was the Messiah, and now Jesus is saying to him, Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. He said, you're depending on what's going on in here, but that's not the whole story. He had that independence of thinking, I've got this right, I've got this figured it out, I'll do it my way. Jesus, do it my way. But it was wrong. He was severely scolded. In fact, Jesus called him Satan, if you take it a certain way. Jesus was actually referring to the spirit behind what was said, is the fact. But extremely scolded. He was looking at things from a human perspective, not God's perspective. But I find myself doing the same thing at times, don't you? I don't have the whole picture, and yet I say, do it my way. But that independence doesn't take us forward. We see this happening further, later in the ministry. In the Garden of Gethsemane, in John chapter 18, verses 3 through 11. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers, some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. When Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to him, "Who do you seek?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. So he asked them again, "Who do you seek?" They said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go." The guys that were with him, Jesus said, let them go. Peter was part of that group. This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken, "Of those whom you have given me, I have lost not one." Then Simon Peter, having a sword, it was open carry apparently, and he felt justified in doing it, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword in its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?" We have this same independent attitude portraying itself in Peter once again. We know early in the story his flesh was weak because he and his buddies were all sleeping. Here's Jesus last night before going to the cross, and Jesus says, "Pray with me a while." And he prayed about as well as I do at times, with his eyes closed. I suppose you could say it's a form of tongues because it goes something like that. There were no recognizable words. But how convicting, huh? Couldn't stay awake, his flesh was weak. This speaks of the dullness that there was spiritually happening amongst him and his brothers, where Jesus was very clear what was about to happen. He was depending on the flesh once again. He was caught in that life of flesh, not understanding spiritually what was happening. He wakes up, seeing the soldiers all around, and he continues the work of the flesh, pulls out his sword, and from a human perspective calls it self-defense. Cuts off the ear of this person that was coming to arrest Jesus, part of the band that was going to do that. But it was a work of the flesh. Peter had the attitude, "I know how to get us out of this situation. I know what to do." But the problem is we can't save ourselves. We're helpless, aren't we? Jesus was in complete control of the situation. And in fact, when he turned to the crowd, he simply said, "I am he." They all fell over. There was no sword involved. There was power from the Holy Spirit. There was power in the situation. He let him get up and said, "Who are you seeking?" He says, "I tell you again, I am he." Peter, "I can do this. Let me at him." We can't save ourselves. Sooner or later, we've got to come to that conclusion. Romans 5, verses 6 through 8 says, "For while we were still weak, while we were letting the flesh, our our humanity control the situation instead of that which is spiritual. And we've got to combine this with the story previous where Jesus said to him, you're thinking from human thoughts and not godly thoughts. When we're letting that area rule, we are just weak. While we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While we're in our weakness, he came for us. That says to me, it's much better for us to realize we're weak. We're weak. Do I think of things from a human perspective? I do. I'm weak. But that's when Christ died for us. What hope there is for us. Do we know how weak we really are? It's best to admit it and be steadfast in God's work, saying, I am weak. God doesn't want us to live in sin, but he wants us to live in a place where we're so weak that we're dependent on his grace to do the work for us, where he does it. So what he has said he will do, he does because we're in a place of humility next to him. Peter, however, continued to fail. He said, no, I've got this taken care of. The story continued that night. In Luke 22:31-34, Jesus said, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you and that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. Peter said to him, Lord, I am ready to go with you both to prison and to death. Jesus said to him, I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow this day until you deny me 3 times that you know me. Later in the story, after Gethsemane, verse 54, then they seized him and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house, and Peter was following at a distance. And when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat down among them. Then a servant girl, seeing him as he sat at the light and looking closely at him, said, this man also was with him. Now it's time for him to act weak. He denied it, saying, woman, I do not know you. And a little later, someone else saw him and said, you are also one of them. But Peter said, man, I am not. And after an interval of about an hour, another insisted, saying, certainly this man was with him, for he too is a Galilean. They could tell by his accent where he was from. But Peter said, man, I do not know what you are talking about. And immediately while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he had said to him, before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. All confident Peter, I've got this, Lord. I can figure this out. I can maneuver my way through this life. He knew better than that, didn't he? Do we know better than that? That's not an excuse, is it? Because we all know better than that. But yet our humanity takes over, the sin nature in us, and it denies the very Son of God. Peter thought, I'm willing to go to prison for you. I'm willing to even die for you. But it wasn't the truth. It wasn't the truth. So what do we learn from these stories this morning? Where does this put us? Simon Peter, the independent, couldn't make it on his own, could he? He couldn't do it by himself. And the fact is, neither can we. Neither can I. Can you say that? Neither can I. Dependence on self is a formula for failure. It's destined to lead us towards denial of Christ. Because we're at that, as soon as we depend on ourselves, we're unwilling to receive His ability that we call grace. His grace for us to stand in the moment. So where do we go from here? What do we do about this? Well, in looking at the life of Peter, there's a couple things I would say. And the first one is, we all need to learn to not talk about ourselves. We need to learn to not talk about ourselves. Generally, who is the person you talk most about? I don't know. We've had conversations. What is the word that we start most sentences with? Ay, 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 ay. Isn't it? I don't want to do that. I did this. I'm going to, I. We tend to talk about ourselves way too much. And in fact, one of the biggest failures I see in my own life, as well as the life of many around me, is when we say, I don't want to be like so-and-so because. And who do we end up being most like? Do you know why that happens? Because we have our eyes on them instead of our eyes on the Lord. And when we have our eyes on them, even if it's in a negative way of saying, I'll never be like them, we're looking at them. And we deny Christ. I'll never deny you, Lord. I'm willing to go to prison with you today. I'll never deny you. I'll even die for you. I. We've got to get out of this rut of talking about ourselves and seeing ourselves as the center of everything that's going on, the center of the universe that rotates around us. It doesn't work. We've got to be careful about focus on ourselves. But second, we need to realize that we're basically prone to failure. It's best to admit this, admit it soon, and admit it often. We're prone to failure. Proverbs 28:13 says, whoever conceals his transgressions will not prosper, but he who confesses and forsakes them will obtain mercy. I need mercy. Now there's one you can say, because I am prone to failure. Now don't say that bragging about it, but we are. On September 3rd, 1989, Varig Airlines Flight 254 was at the Brazilian Maraba Airport preparing for takeoff. Pretty normal day for the people on the flight and probably for those running the flight. Under normal circumstances, the short flight to a nearby city would only take 48 minutes. Captain Garcia consulted a computer-generated flight plan and read the number 027, which corresponded to the magnetic heading that he needed to take from the city he was in to the city that he needed to get to. But he was distracted because the World Cup soccer match was going on, the championship game, and instead of dialing in 027, he dialed in 270. Ken, is that a bad thing? How old were you in 1989, Ken? It's a bad thing. Thank you for flying our airlines. But Garcia was distracted and he put 270 where he was headed. Minutes later, Flight 254 took off and climbed to an altitude of 29,000 feet. Instead of heading northeast towards the Brazilian coastline, the city of Belém, the plane turned west and headed straight towards the Amazon forest. Captain Garces sensed something was wrong. At this point in the flight plan, he expected to be able to have visual contact with the airport. Despite knowing where he was, Captain Garces informed the flight coordinator that he was working with on the ground that he estimated the plane would land in about 5 minutes. But he really had no idea where he was. 7:39, when the flight was 68 minutes overdue, the first officer identified the problem and started to explain to the captain his mistake. But the captain dismissed his explanation. Refusing to ask for help, he began counting the minutes until the plane would run out of fuel. While he searched on the ground for a place to land at an airport, there wasn't one to be seen. About an hour later, they ran out of fuel. Captain Garces made a remarkable crash landing in the darkness in the middle of the Amazon tropical rainforest. The plane was 700 miles from its intended destination. All 6 of the crew survived, but 13 passengers out of the 48 in the back perished. He lost his license, so did the other guy. Neither of them were to ever fly again as employees. I, unwilling to admit I'm prone to failure. I'm prone to mistakes. He had to go through several brick walls that were placed in front of him trying to correct the problem, and yet he refused that just like we do. Now, we can make strong statements. In Luke 18, verses 11 and 12, I find myself in this story. It says, the Pharisee standing by himself prayed thus, God, I thank you that I am not like the other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all I get. We think we're better than we are, but the fact is we are prone toward failure. All of us are. All of us are. The sooner we can admit that, the more often we can admit that, the more grace, I believe, that is available to us. We've got to know and understand our place next to Christ. If Peter would have recognized his place next to Christ early on, his walk, at least through these stories, may have looked very different. If he, in humility, realized his need and reached out for grace, reached out for God's ability to change the situation, instead of saying in himself, I've got this, I can do this, don't bother me, do we know our place next to him? Matthew 23, verse 12 says, whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. We've got to know and understand our place next to Christ. Next to him, because only he can save us. Only he will win the day. Only he can carry us through the storm that we're in the middle of, even right now in life. Only he understands what's at the end. The sooner we can have that dependence, that reliance on him, the sooner we can safely land in his presence. Now, it's true, we're not where we should be yet. Are we? So that means we've got to humble ourselves. we've got to admit that we're prone to failure. We've got to allow ourselves that place of humility next to Christ. That's not downgrading us. It's just telling the truth. Lord, I can't do it without you. Saying that we're worthless and nothing and never will be, that's not true either. But that's not humility. Humility is saying, Christ, you are able to do this, and I want to stand close to you and be dependent on your grace to see me through, because I can't do it. Let's stand together this morning. The Lord desires us to walk humbly before Him, to depend on His ability to do what I can't do. Peter, at this stage of his life, had difficulty understanding that story, as every one of us do. Difficulty in figuring it out, that it's only by His grace that we can make it through, because we are prone to wander, prone to failure. But by His stripes we're healed. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we come to you today with thankfulness.